The pure versus the practical. Emor 5781. We're cruising along reading Parshat Emor, speaking about Kedusha, holiness. No surprise. Sefer Vayikra, a book of Leviticus, deals heavily with issues of Kedusha, holiness. One of its nicknames is Torat Kohanim, the priestly instruction. It talks about korbanot, sacrifices, the menorah, lechem hapanim, the showbread, all issues dealing with the sanctuary and holiness. But then we have a surprise, a narrative, the narrative of the blasphemer, the man who curses God and is executed for cursing God. The question is, what's the connection between Kedusha on one hand, holiness, and the blasphemer on the other? Rabbi Hirsch points out we've actually seen this pattern before with Parshat Yitro followed by Parshat Mishpatim. Yitro deals with revelation, the revelation at Sinai, the ultimate Kedusha, the ultimate holiness. Mishpatim, which follows, deals with very practical, mundane situations. How do we treat our slaves kindly? What is tort law to look like? What constitutes manslaughter? The message is Kedusha, holiness, is not limited to Sinai. Kedusha should be infused into the real world, into our everyday lives, into our interpersonal relationships. Likewise, Emor follows the same pattern. It begins with the Kedusha, the holiness of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, which was a portable Sinai, but ends with a practical application, a real world application in the narrative of the blasphemer. Again, the message is the same. Holiness is not relegated to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary. It has to be infused into the community, into our everyday lives. Now, of course, the blasphemer was removed from the community. He was executed for his sin. But there's a lot more to the story than simply one man who makes a horrific mistake. What happens is two men are struggling, they're fighting. One man has two Israelite parents, the other man has an Israelite mother from the tribe of Dan, and an Egyptian father. Now remember, tribal identity is passed on through the father. You're a Kohen because your father is a Kohen. You're a Levite because your father is a Levite. You're a Yisrael because your father is a Yisrael. So this man has no tribal identity, even though his mother is a Danite, his father is an Egyptian. He has no tribal identity. Chazal, our sages, pick up on the fact that they were fighting. These two guys were struggling in the machana, in the camp. The word camp here indicates, according to our sages, that they were struggling over issues of inheritance, particularly that this man with the Israelite mother and the Egyptian father wanted to dwell among the Danites, but they said, no, we're sorry. Yes, your mother is a Danite, but that's not what is determinative of if you are a Danite. Your father is an Egyptian. You're not a Danite. Sorry, you can't live among us. He's a man without a country. He gets into a fight with another regarding the issue. And in the midst of the fight, unfortunately, he curses God. And God commands that the assembly, the entire assembly, stone him to death for his blasphemy. But Chazal reminds us it's not just the fault of the blasphemer for his sin. Yes, he's at fault, absolutely. But he's not the only one who's at fault. The Danites were unduly harsh. They should have learned from the example of Timnah. According to the Talmud, Timnah wanted to marry into the family of the Avot, Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. However, she was a mamzeret, in other words, the daughter of an adulterous relationship. So, according to the Talmud, she was rejected by the family of Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. However, she was so eager to marry into this family, she found another way into the family. She went through the back door, shall we say, and went to Asav's side of the family. Not only did she marry into Asav's side of the family, she wound up having a child after marrying into Asav's side of the family, and the child's name was Amalek. Amalek, the arch nemesis of Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. Amalek, evil incarnate itself. The message of Hazal is quite clear that if you push people away, you will alienate them, and beware of what you can create when you push people away. You could wind up biting yourself big time. And that's exactly what happened here. The fact that the entire community was commanded to stone the blasphemer, according to Hazal, indicates that, in a sense, the entire community was guilty of standing by as this poor fellow was ostracized from the community, probably called a half breed. They allowed him to be a man without a country, and because of that, he took matters into his own hands in the most unfortunate possible way one can do so, by cursing God. Reminds us there's an element here of communal responsibility as well. Now, of course, we should note that the blasphemer could have done better himself. He should have learned, or at least done what later on Benot Slovchad would do. Benot Slovchad also had a grievance regarding property. But what did they do? They didn't curse God. They didn't become violent. Instead, they went to Moshe and said, "We would like to inherit. We, the daughters of Slochad, would like to inherit property." Moshe said, "Hold on, let me go have a consultation with God." Walked over, had a consultation with God. God said, "They're correct. They should be allowed to inherit property." And they were allowed to inherit the property. Notice the difference here. No cursing, no violence, no fighting. They assertively but politely made a request, and the situation was handled peacefully within the bounds of halacha. Moshe consulted God, a decision was given, and that was the end of it. They were allowed to inherit property. Why didn't the blasphemer use that example? Granted, it hadn't happened yet, but why didn't he take that approach? Probably because his whole life he had been called a half breed, felt like an outsider, a man without a country, and therefore felt that no one was willing to listen to him. Let me ask you a question. Why do people riot? People riot because they feel that nobody is going to listen to them. The only way they can get the attention of others is to become violent. Now, let me make it clear I am in no way whatsoever condoning rioting or violence. It's illegal, and those who engage in such behavior should be arrested. It is totally unacceptable. But the point I'm making here is it's important that we listen to each other so people don't get to the stage where they engage in very horrendous behavior. Think about the most famous Jewish command, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. Our job is to listen. So that means we should avoid using language which shuts down communication, which ends conversation. When you see somebody who's getting upset, who has a grievance, if you're going to throw your hands up in the air and say, "Ah, there they go again, the same old complaints over and over again," or "They're just a bunch of angry guys complaining, they're afraid," that type of response shuts down communication and escalates. You're dismissing the underlying grievance, which may be legitimate. So, again, violence, rioting, absolutely unacceptable. No tolerance for that. But what we do need to do, on the other hand, is be able to dialogue and hear what the other person is saying. Let's flip it to the other side of the coin now. If you have a grievance, it's incumbent on you to protest in a manner that does not tear apart the fabric of society. Protest peacefully, organize politically. Follow the example of Martin Luther King. So let's remember that we're talking about Kedusha, holiness here. The Torah talks about holiness, but always directs that holiness back towards the real world. The point is, we live in an imperfect world, and our job is not to retreat from that world. We're not meant to be angels. We're meant to roll up our sleeves, perhaps get a little dirty, in an attempt to clean up the world and infuse Kedusha into the real world. I think in essence, that's what Nancy Pelosi meant in a comment that's coming out in a new book about her. She criticized the squad, as they call them, as posing as perfect and pure progressives. She's not necessarily disagreeing with their policy suggestions. What she's saying is when you're in a position of leadership, you have to get things done. And at times that means you have to compromise. And by the way, John Boehner, who was also a Speaker of the House, made the same criticisms basically about his caucus. You have to be able to balance purity with the practical need to get things done. And where you strike that balance, of course, is a judgment call. What Pelosi and Boehner are saying is sometimes you have to tilt a little bit in the direction of practicality. You can't always be pure if you want to move the ball down the field. Let me give you another practical example of how being overly pure could actually hinder your long term goals. Lincoln loathed slavery, absolutely loathed it. But at the beginning of the Civil War, he did not come out in support of emancipation. Why? Very practical reason why. If he did, he was concerned he'd lose the border states, and that would set back efforts to win the war and eventually emancipate slaves. He could have immediately endorsed emancipation. There were those who were urging him to do so. He could have been pure and done so, but that would have undercut, set back the aim, the practical ends of ending slavery. And he realized that and made the correct decision. This balance of the pure versus the practical is also symbolized by the tachelet, the turquoise thread on the tzitzit, which is surrounded by white strings, white threads of tzitzit. Why do we have this one turquoise string among the white? The white symbolizes purity, heaven, the goal. The goal is to purify this world, to make it as heaven like, as God like as possible. But it just doesn't happen by itself. How do we get to heaven and purity? We have to go through the sea, which is symbolized by the tachelet, that turquoise string. The sea symbolizes, of course, this world. In other words, while we want to head up towards heaven, the road to heaven takes us through this world, and the tachelet reminds us at times we have to get a little dirty in order to clean up the world, in order to make this world more godlike. As long as we're headed in the right direction and working towards purifying the world, even if we get a little dirty, we're doing the right thing.